Hi, good afternoon. My name is Julian Hattem. I'm with the Hill newspaper, and welcome to the inaugural episode of TechFreedomTV. We've got an excellent panel here. We're going to do a little bit of talking about what Tuesday's elections mean for tech policy, both in the rest of the year and then going forward with the new Congress. I want to say at the top, if anyone out there has any questions, please feel free to weigh in, either on Twitter at hashtag TechFreedomTV, or shoot us an email, media@techfreedom.org. Just introductions real quick. First off, we've got Keenan here with the Minority Media and Telecommunications Council, David Redl with the Energy and Commerce Committee, Mr. Rob Atkinson with the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation, and last but not least, Berin Szoka here with TechFreedom. I want to start this off pretty big picture, guys, just chat about what happened on Tuesday and really what that means going forward. Pretty big Republican majorities now in both chambers. What does this mean, and how will things change, really, for the next month and a half and for the next 2 years? Berin, if you want to weigh in, perhaps.
Well, I think that remains to be seen. The Republicans have a choice. They can either spend the next 2 years doing the kinds of things that they did in the last few years, like voting again and again and again to repeal Obamacare, or they can actually get something done. And there are a lot of things that they could do in tech policy that are subject to bipartisan compromise. They'd be fairly easy passes, and there's some things that are harder, but that could really make a legacy for this Congress, like a new Communications Act. So I think they have an opportunity to actually show they can lead. Mitch McConnell said that he really wants to work on compromise the way that he has for the last few years. He's been responsible for the big 3 deals that have been struck with the president. So I think if you see that kind of leadership, the Republicans could really finally do something, and tech policy is perhaps the best area for them to reach out to young voters, for them to repair their brand, and for them to seize the mantle that they had in the 80s about being the party of optimism, the party of progress, and of dynamism. That's theirs to take.
And technology policy is not necessarily the most partisan issue, right? We're not talking about Obamacare here. We're not talking about some of these, gun legislation, stuff like that. This should be stuff that there could be some compromise on.
We hope so, because the truth is, I think the mandate from the election was essentially that both sides need to work it out, because people are not happy with anybody right now. And I think if they start to focus on the things that really matter, like a Communications Act update, because let's face it, the law is way, way behind telecommunications, and while they're out there having whatever gridlock they've had in the past, back up on an edge provider world, they're on the next curve, and so we've got to catch up with them, and so it's time to get together and get some of these things done. And I do think that it's clear, having the Republicans win on Tuesday, is that Title II is out.
I mean, we're certainly hoping that's the case, but yeah, the interesting thing from our perspective on House Energy and Commerce is that from the moment that my boss, Chairman Fred Upton, in 2012 asked us to embark on this COM Act update process, all along, we've known it would have to be a bipartisan process in order for us to get to something that people could agree to. And frankly, that's been the hallmark of our committee, is getting bipartisan deals done. Currently, there are 6 bills out of the Subcommittee on Communications and Technology that are pending in the Senate, and those 6 bills are all unanimous. They all either received a unanimous vote or passed on voice vote out of the House. And so we know how to make deals. We know how to get bipartisanship on communications issues. And as we move forward on COM Act update, that's exactly what we plan to do, to work with our colleagues, both our Senate and our House Democrat colleagues, and try to find ways to move policy forward.
So I want to build on something you said, Berin, which is about going back to the 80s for the Republican Party and when they were seen as a party of the future, morning in America, optimism. And I think tech is actually an area where you can do that, because unfortunately, a lot of people on the left, not necessarily a lot or even a majority of the Democratic members, but a lot of people on the left look at tech now and are painting a picture of tech as a big threat to people, a big threat to Americans. It's going to kill their jobs. It's going to take their privacy away. They're going to not have security. And that's a false narrative. And I think the Republicans have a giant opportunity to paint a narrative about moving into the digital future with a lot of promise, a lot of gusto, and U.S. leadership. And they could do that if they pass a lot of these bills that David was talking about.
Well, I couldn't agree with you more. I would just add to that the best part of the Democratic Party was the part of Bill Clinton's presidency in the 90s. It was really continuing and seizing that mantle from the Reagan era. So in the 90s, the Democrats were all about investment and innovation and hands off the net. they were continuing some of the best parts of the 1980s policies. And so there's an opportunity. Those people are still around. The new Democrats of the 1990s are still here. Many of them have spoken up on tech policy issues. They came out hard in 2010 when the FCC first talked about returning to Title II. And they defended Bill Kennard's legacy, which was to start moving away from old monopoly-era regulations. That's, I think, the strategic opportunity for Republicans, is to find those Democrats and sit down with them. And you could see them coming up with, if not a veto-proof majority, then something that the president could actually sign.
Yeah, well, we, again, at MMTC, we've been very focused. We've, been out against Title II from the beginning. But certainly, there are other opportunities to find a way to compromise and get together. I mean, Section 706 makes it clear that there are ways to really let the net have innovation, let it have had the opportunities for investment, because this is what's important at this time. This is not your mother's telephone company. And you can't have an act from 1934 that's going to be able to deal with the things that we have today. However, I do think that for consumers, there needs to be some mechanism like the one that's used in Title II and Title VII, that allows people to make a complaint in a reasonable way that's transparent, that doesn't need all 5 of us lawyers there to help them out, and so that they can actually say if there is a problem. So I think we've offered that, like the Title VII approach, as a way of allowing people to make a complaint, have it be responded to, and then have another response, and then the FCC, as a subject matter expert, would be able to respond to that. And I think that those kinds of compromises will move the ball forward for everybody.
I want to talk about specific policy issues like net neutrality, the open internet rules, but first, there are still some kind of outstanding questions even after Tuesday. There are still some vacancies. Lee Terry has lost his election race in Nebraska, which leaves an important hole in the Energy and Commerce Committee. There's also in the Senate, presumably John Thune's going to be the chairman over there, and there's a little bit of a shakeup. Bill Nelson is likely to rise to the top Democrat. What are the races that you guys are watching? Which of these fights are you guys watching, and what are the possible impacts of what those intercommittee battles mean?
Well, I'll just start with that. I think the House Oversight Chairman race is wide open at this point. Darrell Issa has been very aggressive. He's also been perhaps too aggressive in some ways, and he's certainly alienated Democrats on that committee. So it remains to be seen what direction Oversight's going to take in the House. And I think the election of the chairman will help to shape that. I think it's really important because oversight is obviously one of the tools that Congress has to discipline regulatory agencies. And if you have the Senate in Republican hands, you have oversight on both sides that could really put some pressure on regulatory agencies. So that's number one. The second would be Lee Terry's leaving the Commerce, Manufacturing, and Trade Subcommittee. That post is now open. I would think that Marsha Blackburn, having been vice chair of that committee, would want very much to be chair of that subcommittee instead of being vice chair of the full committee. And if she does take that on, I think that probably means that she's going to be less engaged on net neutrality because she'll be busy with consumer protection. So that probably means, on the one hand, that you'd see a little more room for compromise on net neutrality. Some of the harder line views that Republicans have taken, just very directly equating net neutrality with government control of the internet, are difficult framings for Republicans to walk away from. So that opens some room for a deal. But it also means that you might see more oversight of the Federal Trade Commission and how the FTC is regulating privacy, data security, and product design. And then the third would be the ranking member race on Energy and Commerce Subcommittee for tech is wide open. And so if that's Anna Eshoo, you can see a lot more interest from someone who really knows the tech industry's issues and who might be willing to make a deal.
Yeah, I'll just jump in on the issue point because I think that'll tell you somewhat of where the Democratic Party looks to position themselves, because Eshoo is seen as a champion of the tech innovation. She's from the Valley. She has a deep background in this, and historically, and Berin, you mentioned in the 90s, I mean, the Clinton administration was very close to tech. As you recall, in '92, it was Silicon Valley that supported the Clinton administration and Gore, because the Bush administration just frankly wasn't even on their radar screen. And so I think it sends an important signal to the technology community if the Democrats put Ms. Eshoo in the chairmanship.
And there's a really interesting kind of
leadership
difference in the party here between Anna Eshoo, Silicon Valley, left coast, progressive in that way, and Frank Pallone, who's New Jersey, kind of like a lot of labor ties. It's interesting, different characterizations of the Democratic Party, I guess.
Yeah.
So the lame duck is coming up, obviously. It is here, arguably. Net neutrality is one of these things that we're going to be seeing in the next couple of months. There's going to be something out of the FCC, whether a hybrid proposal, whether something more controversial, less controversial. How do you think that what happened on Tuesday have any bearing on what happens at the FCC? And how is that process affected, not just in the next 2 months, but going forward by the electoral process?
Well, let me just say at the outset that we also saw the story in the Wall Street Journal suggesting that the chairman's going down some sort of hybrid route. It's important to note that that doesn't seem to be based on a leak. That seems to be just a confirmation of what the rumors around the FCC are saying. So I wouldn't put too much stock in it as predicting what the chairman's likely to do. On the other hand, it is consistent with what everyone seems to be saying. Kim said earlier that the election means that Title II won't happen. I'm not so sure about that. I think it's going to be very difficult for the Republicans to really dislodge the agency once they do whatever it is they're going to do, unless they can actually get Democrats on board with a legislative deal. Republicans have talked in the past about a Congressional Review Act disapproval resolution. I think that's kind of a waste of time, frankly, unless you get it to a point where you can pass it with a veto-proof majority. It's not going to get you anywhere. And the chairman knows that. The chairman knows that whatever he's going to do, he can do, and that'll be the status quo, and that'll be the beginning of negotiations. Now, that doesn't mean that Title II is a good idea. I think it's as bad an idea as it ever was, and that the hybrid ideas that are being talked about are either really Title II with just some window dressing. The Mozilla proposal basically is Title II plus 706. That's no better than invoking Title II. There are some other proposals that involve using Title II only for some parts of the internet. Those are somewhat better, but they still raise a huge host of problems. And I don't see the agency being so foolish as a legal matter as to really think that they can deal with those, but they might be. And so if they do open that door, I think it's going to, on the one hand, make Republicans a lot more likely to want to get a legislative deal done. It's also going to make some Democrats a lot less willing to compromise.
So it may be, in the words of Mitch McConnell, it may be raising a red flag at the bull, right? If they go into Title II.
Well, I think Chairman Wheeler has been very focused on coming up with a solution. So I think hybrid has to be the way that he has to come up with, because Title II, everybody says, oh, you can just use parts, but again, it wasn't even written to deal with the environment that we have today. And so I think that he is going to try to cull together something that has some consumer protection, but also is able to allow for innovation and investment in the internet, because that's something that all Americans need. And certainly, I'm hoping that we just drop in here somewhere. I'm hoping that a Republican leadership will feel the same as any other leadership, that it's very important that they get together and make sure that our schools have broadband everywhere, not just in the places where it's fun and you make lots of money to do it, but everybody should be agreeing on these kinds of things. And I think those things will be a start and an inroad to making them happen.
Well, if that's the goal, waving the red sheet in front of the bowl, invoking Title II, is the worst thing the chairman could do. That will poison the well for bipartisan compromise going forward.
I don't think he's going to do that.
Well, let's hope not.
Well, he might do the half Title II, which is the hybrid approach. And I think what we forget is the Wheeler proposal initially was a compromise. That was the compromise. That was the right compromise. And Wheeler now has backed off of that compromise. What Wheeler should have come out with and said, there's no way we're going to do anything with this. And then later on come out and say, here's my great Solomonic compromise. Now he compromised, and the left as well, and you got to go farther, farther, farther. But I think what the election has done is it has put him in a tougher spot, because I think there will be tough oversight, and I think there will be budget issues, and there will at least be threats. So I don't know that he can act with impunity. Certainly not the way he could have on Monday.
And at least in terms of the way things have changed since the election, I mean, frankly, for my bosses, things haven't changed. We've been out in front of this issue from day one saying we don't believe that net neutrality rules need to be put in place at all. point blank, that we believe it's a solution in search of a problem. And no one seems to be able to give us a reason other than there might someday be some harms as a reason to put these rules in place. That being said, the real harm is going Title II. And it doesn't matter if it's Title II reclassification in toto, or if it's application of some part of Title II, or application of Title II to part of broadband. Title II is not fit for internet access services, and we shouldn't be trying to apply it.
But there is some political pressure on Wheeler here in either to do some level of Title II, right? Both within his own commission, the other two Democratic commissioners have seemed supportive of something Title II similar, or something robust in that regard, but also just from the nation writ large, there was this obviously very, very vocal response after the initial proposal kind of supporting Title II or something. And in the lame duck period, in the lame duck presidency rather, there's this narrative that the president has to act through administrative action. And so there are certainly pressures on them. How do you think that he deals with that and walks this tightrope in which no one is really happy?
Well, I think a lot of people are writing in. I know on behalf of MMTC, we filed comments, and again, we recommended Section 706, but we added this sort of Title VII component that would give them the opportunity to hear complaints, because they're the best people to know whether it's just a regular a consumer complaint or whether there is some technical issue that has to be addressed. And I think that is a way of dealing with the Democratic commissioners who are concerned that the public is somehow going to lose if we don't have some really technical Title II. But the fact of the matter is Section 706 will allow those things to be done, but if we add in this Title VII sort of, pull this thing over from there, we will allow people to be able to make those complaints. Because if there's a real complaint to be made, we saw that they made 3 million, there were 3 million comments to the FCC, and I guess we'll get to process later. I mean, the day is going to come when people are going to, they're going to have to address these things, but at least they are the repository, they are the subject matter experts on this issue, and they're best able to deal with whether it's a real complaint, something that the FCC could do something about or that we would want them to do something about, or whether it's just something that's, the provider, we need to let those providers know that they're not doing what they said they would do.
So there were 3 million complaints or filings, and there were probably 3 votes made, in other words. It had no effect on the election. It's a single race. And when you look at the exit polling,
that's true.
Nobody votes on net neutrality.
Right.
Yeah.
So I agree with you, Kim. I think what the chairman could do is he could say, okay, we're going to take my original thing, which is a compromise, which is saying, you know what, there's certain things you can't do, you can prioritize under certain rules, add in some of these other things, better complaint process, what they can do with what's called the BTAG, a technical advisory group that looks at these from a technical, gives their review of that. I think he becomes forward with that, and then on top of that starts talking about broadband to schools and broadband to rural, and let's move on to the real issues here for America. I think he's fine.
Well, Kim, you might just want to clarify for everybody, when you talk about Title VII, you're talking about case-by-case modeled on the Civil Rights Act.
Right, I'm talking about yes, exactly, but this is the key. In Civil Rights Act, it's like, when you complain about your employer, that's fact-specific. That's like, and yesterday I did this, and then we did this. But if you move it over to this context, the complaints will pretty much fall. They'll be complaining about the same thing. And those 3 million filings, I mean, you could have just said, okay, we're going to put all the ones like this in a bucket. And then you wouldn't have had 3 million complaints anymore. You might have had 3.
Right. So where I agree with you is that if you have a case-by-case enforcement approach, you can deal with real problems. The things people are concerned about are anti-competitive behavior. That's why we already have the antitrust laws and consumer protection laws. Those of us who've been skeptical of net neutrality regulation for the last decade have said those are our first line of defense. If we're going to layer something on top of those, we should be clear as to what exactly the need is. Where is it that those laws are deficient? But I just would remind everybody that we already had a bipartisan compromise on this proposed 9 years ago. So Progress and Freedom Foundation, my former think tank, brought together a working group that was composed mostly of Democrat telecom academics and scholars. And they produced the Digital Age Communications Act. And that was a way to do a part of a rewrite that would give the FCC the authority, once and for all finally clear, without all the legal debates that it's been stuck in for the last 10 years, to police net neutrality, as well as IP transition, interconnection, all these issues about the internet, broad authority, but to restrain it, to make sure the FCC has to explain itself and justify its interventions, and to show that when it does intervene, whether it's case by case or if it's through regulations, that it's actually making consumers better off. I think that was basically the right approach. And at the time, that was introduced by no less a conservative stalwart than Jim DeMint, who now runs the Heritage Foundation. So to me, Republicans have already been willing to be pragmatic about this issue. I think you could see that sort of thing happen today, and that could either happen as part of a larger rewrite, the kind of thing that the Energy and Commerce Committee is working on that Dave can talk about, or maybe that happens as part of a standalone deal, especially if the chairman invokes Title II. But one way or another, from my perspective, there has to be legislation. Because even if the chairman says, I'm not going to invoke Title II, and I'm just going to use Section 706, Title II is still going to be hanging out there. That docket's still open. That threat's always going to hang over the internet, number one. And number two, 706 is better as an alternative to Title II. It's better because it allows for case by case. It's focused on real harms. But as a way to govern the internet, just saying the FCC can do anything it wants that it thinks makes broadband better to any company in the internet ecosystem is insane. And Republicans ultimately are going to be able to, I think, agree with Republicans on that because, excuse me, Republicans, they can agree with Democrats.
That's not always clear.
Yeah, it's not always clear whether any of them are.
Nobody in the tech sector actually wants to live under that regime going forward. Nobody's talking about that right now because they want to just hold their fire about 706. But I think that there is actually an incentive for both sides to cut a deal that says no Title II. 706 is not an independent grant of authority. It was just a command to promote broadband using other grants of authority, and then some specific grant of authority to deal with net neutrality concerns. If you throw into that mix something to promote broadband deployment, to make things easier for new companies to enter the market, I think you have the contours of a deal.
So how much of what's happening at the FCC is a sideshow to what will ultimately be a Capitol Hill legislative proposal? I mean, is that, whether it's a rewrite of the Telecom Act or something more narrower, more targeted, do lawmakers end up making this decision no matter what?
I mean, we're obviously working in parallel.
Mm-hmm.
The FCC has its mandate, and it's moving forward with the act it's got, and certainly we don't fault them for that. But that's not going to slow us down from looking at whether or not it's time to change that governing document. And I think what has come out in the number of white papers we've done is that a lot of people have a lot of ideas for how to improve the Communications Act, how to make it better fit the way that the communications marketplace actually works. And frankly, I'll promote my own boss's bill, ways to improve the way the FCC works.
Mm-hmm.
The FCC isn't exactly the model agency for transparency and efficiency and collegiality. I mean, there are times when it's great, there are times when it's not great. And my boss had us do a lot of work with taking a bill that was a very partisan bill, at one point, and come together with our Democratic colleagues to produce one that was passed unanimously in the House. Unfortunately, it is sitting waiting for action in the Senate, so we're looking forward to try and see if we can get some of those proposals to get the FCC being more responsive to the public and moving in a more efficient manner as we move forward in the next Congress.
Where do you go from here? You've obviously done a very extensive white paper analysis and hearing from smart people like many of those at this table. What do we look forward next year and then into 2016? How does this process go forward?
So my bosses were very clear. December 2012, they sat down, they said, we want you to start looking at how to update the Communications Act, and we want you to spend the next year doing the due diligence of how that would look. And so we've done a series of white papers, and there are more to come. We have a couple more in the queue that we're hoping to get released toward the end of this year to inform the work we're doing. And then, as my bosses have said very publicly recently, we look forward to putting pen to paper in January. We want to take action. We want to get some documents out there for people to be talking about. We think this is an issue that people really want to engage on, which is evident by the fact that in the last couple of days, I think we've seen more stories on the Com Act update than we saw in the last year. So there's a real hunger to engage on this issue, and we're really looking forward to having that debate and moving something forward.
In terms of timing, how long the previous the Telecom Act of '96 was an effort 4 years in the making, if not much longer. Do you think this is something that can be done by 2016, and then there's a whole new political system going on, there are whole new pressures? Is there a pressure to get this done quickly, or do you feel like you have the time and space? And expanding it out, do you think lawmakers have the time and space to?
I mean, I'm not sure you can compare the '96 Act to what we're trying to do. The '96 Act was actually, despite being one of the more sweeping changes to the Communications Act, was fairly narrowly focused when you look at the world of communications. It addressed local telephone service. It's pretty much it. Local telephone service. It was a sweeping change for its time, but what we're looking at with the modern communications marketplace is we're seeing fungibility of networks, and we're seeing everybody moving towards IP and internet services. And so I think in some ways that makes our effort more challenging. There are more services involved, but it also makes it a little easier because people are all moving towards the same sort of service, the same kinds of platforms. We also have a pretty unique opportunity in our hands that we have bipartisan expressions of desire to move forward on some kind of update. And so, that frankly is one of the hardest parts of the process, is making sure that we've got buy-in from both sides of the aisle that this is an effort worth undertaking. And that's where we are. And so we're gonna seize this opportunity and see how we do. I mean, we are absolutely moving forward in the next Congress to move something in the next Congress. I mean, we're not getting ready to put something out there and say, that's okay, we'll do it another year. We want to move forward and be productive.
So I agree with David in the sense of the 96th Act was narrower, but it was about two elephants or Goliath just going like this. And it was long distance versus local, who was going to win. And then layered on top of that, you had, I think, a mistaken focus on trying to get competition on the wire, which ended up fizzling out because it wasn't ever going to be real. And so it was complex, Rube Goldberg in a way. It never really worked. And this is a lot easier in a way. You're right, it's IP transition, it's about internet protocols. There's some really specific things one can do. It's not to say that it's easy, but it's less of this Goliaths going at each other. So I think in that sense, the politics of it perhaps could be even easier.
I would just add to that 20 years ago, the Clinton and Gore tech team, starting with the Vice President, Al Gore, recognized that we needed to move to what they called Title VII, the title they wanted to add to the Communications Act, which would have been technologically neutral. And it would have been one that was very much like what Kim's been describing about Title VII from the Civil Rights Act. It would have been focus on real problems, govern them under a technologically neutral regime. They wanted to do that in 1993, 1994, well before the Republicans ever took the Congress. That idea was revived in DACA in 2005. I think there's a bipartisan recognition that the Telecom Act today, as Dave is saying, has no relationship to the real world. It was obsolete even before it was passed. It does not govern the internet ecosystem. And I don't think it's that hard to get people on board with a rewrite if you can get a deal done on net neutrality. And that means you've got to have some way to deal with real problems, but both sides have to be able to claim a win. And the win's got to be taking Title II off the table, having some way to deal with real problems, but also constraining the agency's discretion. Because right now, the problem with the FCC, all the process problems that Dave alluded to, are ultimately problems caused by the fact that it has vast discretion. And it inevitably will end up having imperial chairmen who do what they want to do on both sides until a court tells them not to. And that's not a good way to govern communications and the internet. You need some substantive standards baked into the law.
Well, I think anything that, you talk about a deal, I think a lot of it is going to have to include some modernization to make sure that modernization doesn't leave part of America behind, because that's really a big issue in America. And people are talking about it. It's like we're talking about all these weeds, the Act, the Title II. But in reality, if you're in the average African-American household, the average Latino household, what you're finding is they're using cell phones. They're not using broadband. They don't have it in their homes. And I'm telling you, they're going to be leaving these kids behind because I have a teenager. He can't do his homework without broadband. We've got to make sure that we have that, because if I have him trying to do it on his phone, I might as well just knock my head against the wall. And I think that any compromises will have to make sure that we don't leave parts of the country behind, because that is going to make the difference in who we produce for the next generation, who's in tech, who's doing these other things. And you can't even barely apply for a job without broadband.
It's even more complicated, right? So as we're starting to look at this internally and say, okay, what are the things we need to look at? We're running up against some of the same challenges in looking at the existing act that the FCC has run up against. So as the FCC has looked at the Universal Service Fund, for example, we've now seen the Connect America Fund and the Mobility Fund severed. Well, it's recognition that, as it turns out, fixed broadband and mobility aren't the same thing, and they have very different challenges. And I think you're absolutely right. Chairman Walden, Subcommittee Chairman Walden, has an extraordinarily large district. He has one of the largest non-at-large districts in the country, a lot of which is very rural.
Yeah.
So these are challenges. Lack of connectivity, either through mobility or through fixed connections, is an issue that's near and dear to his heart and near and dear to his constituents. So it's one that we're paying very close attention to.
Kim, I wanted to go back to your point, because there was a time when the fundamentals of the Democratic Party were about opportunity for working people. That's what they focused on. Net neutrality is orthogonal to that. It's opportunity for college-educated people living in dorm rooms, okay? And I think the deal that can be struck is, on the one hand, sort of doing this light touch around net neutrality, protecting from harms, and then what the Democrats can insist on is, look, we need to make sure we've got real programs for digital literacy. You know, the reason we're behind in broadband has nothing to do with our networks. We're behind in broadband adoption. It's because there's so many people without a computer in this country, without digital literacy, without those tools. So I think the deal is Democrats insist on those kinds of programs, better rural broadband, better digital opportunity, a real lifeline program that's technology neutral, gives people choice about what they use, and then say, look, this is what we want, and a little bit of net neutrality in terms of protecting abuses. And I don't know whether Republicans would go for that, but I think Democrats, if they're smart, would take that deal.
Because, I mean, again, the digital divide is real, and that's real. You know, a lot of what we're talking about, again, you have to, I have my job 30 days now, and you have to really study to know what we're talking about here.
Welcome to our
That's
world.
right. It's like, I got to read white papers, and, you know, you got to have conversations with people who are, you know, wonky to a whole level degree. But I'm telling you something, but digital divide, that's real. That's something you can see every day, and if we don't find a way to make sure that all the schools and all the libraries have this technology, then what we're doing is dooming a whole segment of American society to being left, and I mean left behind, not just in some abstract way.
So you've already seen bipartisan outreach on this. Commissioner Pai, the senior Republican at the FCC, said he wanted to help work out E-rate reforms that would make E-rate easier for schools. It's an incredibly difficult process right now. Schools and libraries have to hire consultants to help them just navigate the process. Many of them don't bother. Many of the schools and libraries that need it most don't do anything. And instead, the chairman basically told him to take a hike, took none of his suggestions, refused to negotiate with him, and left him completely out in the cold, despite the fact that this was a Republican who was trying to make things easier, to make sure we had a more equitable distribution, and importantly, to make sure that E-rate went to what schools and libraries actually needed help with. And that might be, in some cases, connectivity. It might be internal wiring, installing Wi-Fi, buying computers, hiring tech support people. Right? The FCC is so fixated on speed with this sort of technocratic mindset of, it's like the thing that built monorails in some cities and produced supersonic travel. It's the idea that if you just get it fast enough, that's what consumers need. Well, that's not what a lot of schools and libraries actually care about. And Ajit wanted to deal with that, and the FCC refused to. So that was, on the one hand, a sign of Republicans being willing to respond to exactly the concerns you're describing, Kim. On the other hand, the imperial chairmanship at the FCC overruling those concerns. So E-rate's an example of where you could actually make a lot of progress. But I think the bigger opportunity here for Republicans is to ask themselves, what would Jack Kemp do? Because I grew up as a young Republican watching Jack Kemp in 1996 in the vice presidential debates and thinking, why didn't we nominate him instead of Bob Dole? Because Jack Kemp spent the 80s and the 90s preaching empowerment and inclusion and that capitalism uplifted everybody. Right? That was the Republican Party at its best. And I think if Jack Kemp were around today, he'd be going out saying exactly the things that you just said, Kim. He'd be asking, how do we empower every household in America to make sure that everybody can succeed? And what I think he would have done, he'd be saying things like, if we don't open up more spectrum, the people that hurts most are minority and urban users who depend on their cell phones for broadband access. If we don't make it easier to put in wireless infrastructure, to put up towers and small cells in cities, that hurts those people most. And if we don't make it easy to compete for Google Fiber or telcos or cable companies to build new networks, we're not going to have faster broadband or more competition. So those are all good Republican values that intersect with progressive values. That's a great opportunity for pro-deployment reforms.
It is
I want to jump in and say this. I went to high school across the street from Jack Kemp's house. So I need this moment to say this. I mean, I don't know that we can compare half the politicians today to Jack Kemp. I mean, I think he really got the notion that he was there to make a difference for all people. And I think if anything, then we need to start a Jack Kemp school, and then everybody probably should go, because I think he was unique in that way. I do think the party has not aligned behind that kind of vision like that. We're not seeing Jack Kemp-like people. Like, you can't list some whole group of people who were like him. So I think he's unique, but I do think that he had the right ideas, and I think that he was a person of the people. I mean, really, he was a football player. I mean, at the end of the day, that's who he was. And I think some of that is what spilled over into his politics. But, I think a lot of people could take some. We should all be historians and take the best of both parties to move forward.
It's also rather impressive you made that about two Kansans in one fell swoop. Up for Ajit Pai and down for Bob Dole. It's rather impressive.
But I think
You got to know a lot of history for that.
Paul Ryan is very much Jack Kemp's heir in the House. He's preaching the same values. Rand Paul is taking that mantle, and I think that's what Ajit's been doing at the FCC. The point is, that's the kind of messaging that could lead Republicans to use tech policy, as we were saying at the outset here, to really change their brand. Because Rand Paul's right, the Republican brand sucks. And this is a great way to fix that and preach outreach and inclusion instead of just coming across as the party of no or the party of big business.
Well, if they bring back tax certificates, then I'll be able to join in with you, because tax certificates were the single most way that we improved ownership in broadcast and spectrum. But the Republicans did do away with that, and it just seems to me that the things that work, that are shared by people, that are not a problem to do, those are the things that they're wiping out. So I don't understand that.
I would take a little umbrage to your referring to us as the party of no. And as a energy and commerce staffer, I would be remiss if I did not mention that for those that believe that we're not pushing good policy, that we're not making bipartisan deals, that I would urge them to look at the Energy and Commerce Record of Success page. energycommerce.house.gov/record of success. It shows all the bills with bipartisan support that Energy and Commerce has moved, many of which have been signed into law, and a lot more of which, unfortunately, have been stuck in the Senate.
Well, I was talking about perceptions, and I'll just say that Republicans they lose because they don't fight a cultural war. So really, tech is not just another area of policy. It's a cutting-edge part of the culture war. If you want to win young voters, the future of the party, you have to reach out to people on the things that they care about. And people care about tech in a way that they don't care about international trade or even foreign policy. I mean, this is a part of their lives. If you're a 20 or 30-something, this is something that would resonate with you. It's a golden opportunity for Republicans to really change the brand and reclaim the mojo they lost in the 90s.
And so we can see some of the bright young stars in the party are trying to do this. Rand Paul has made a number of trips out to Silicon Valley to try and associate with some of those techno-libertarians out there. Marco Rubio, I was thinking, interestingly teamed up with Cory Booker for a couple of spectrum reform, kind of infrastructure issues. So this is certainly kind of a process that's happening. But I don't want to spend too much time on telecom reform, especially there's so much going on. Looking forward, into the lame duck, shifting gears a tiny bit, one of the things that I'm interested in seeing is what happens with privacy issues and digital security and digital privacy. There's been a lot of talk about NSA reform and potentially something like that happening in the lame duck, if not going forward. Electronic Communications Privacy Act, Email Privacy Act. How much of those things, taken from the libertarian Republican side, the Rand Pauls of the world who have pushed these issues, how much of a chance do we see those advancing forward in the new Congress, and which side of the Republican Party, I guess, will show up? Is it the John McCains or the Rand Pauls?
Well, we spent at TechFreedom, we spent the last 4 years pushing for ECPA reform, and we've been pushing for NSA reform. I'll say those are the two places for the Republican Party to start. ECPA reform, the idea of requiring law enforcement to get a warrant before they access your emails, has 270
in the cloud,
yeah.
Right? Has 270 co-sponsors in the House. That's overwhelmingly bipartisan. So if they can't get that through, they might as well just go home. And I think they will. I think they can. I think they can do that. Unfortunately, it's tied up because regulatory agencies want more power. So you would think that if anything, Republicans would be able to say no to regulatory agencies. That's been the obstacle in the Senate on ECPA reform. That's something that may not happen this Congress, but if it doesn't, it should happen early next Congress. If they're going to do it right, Republicans need to roll in location privacy. That's the other key part of ECPA reform. It's one of the, those are the two top of the 4 principles that the Digital Due Process Coalition has been pushing since 2010. And that would show that they can get something done. But the thing that's really going to pay off for them politically is going to be reining in the NSA and stopping blanket surveillance. That's something that, if there is an issue that actually would resonate in elections, that's it. And that's something that Republicans and Democrats support. Republicans have also been leading on. I think you could see that happen. The sooner it happens for Republicans, the better. They need wins under their belt early in the next Congress if they're going to start moving with momentum.
One of the things I'm interested in, too, is how the loss of Mark Udall from Colorado from the Senate, who was a big critic of the NSA and some of these other intelligence agencies, what that means for this going forward. He was obviously also a member of the Senate Intelligence Committee and was a big proponent on this issue. Do you think that really changes the conversation, his loss?
It's an opportunity for Republicans because it means that Democrats now are going to be more the party of Dianne Feinstein, who has consistently opposed reining in blanket surveillance. It's an opportunity for the Rand Pauls, the Chaffetzes, Sensenbrenners of the Republican Party to show that this is their issue. And you know, at the end of the day, we can talk about bipartisanship all we want, but for the leadership to make this a priority, they have to see that there's something in it for them politically. And if Republicans can claim this as a win, frankly, not having Mark Udall there is actually, it's sort of helpful because it means Republicans can take credit for fixing this problem. So but I'm an optimist. It's just, I think it really comes down to what the leadership is willing to prioritize.
I think the frame for Republicans has got to be twofold. One is it's got to be technological neutrality. We're a party that actually understands, or they can say they're a party that actually understands, that this device is actually a different device than it was 10 years ago because the data is no longer just stored here, but it's stored somewhere else. And whether I store that on my remote server in my basement and I hook it up with Wi-Fi, or whether I store it on a remote server in California and it's hooked up over who knows what telecommunications, there should be no conceptual difference. And I think the Republicans have to make that point. We get this new technology and we want to have it be technology neutral. The second point is about the rule of law and saying we're a party of the rule of law. And the NSA violated the law. They did things that they didn't tell us about. They overreached. We're not about taking away the ability of law enforcement and national security to do the kinds of things they need to do to keep us safe. We're about making sure that they obey the rule of law. And I think that's a good message for Republicans if they can get behind it.
I just add two more things. One, it's good for business. This is critical for American competitiveness internationally. American companies are already suffering because of the perception that the U.S. government is watching everything that goes through servers in the United States. And two, this is about the Constitution. We wouldn't be in this situation if the liberal Supreme Court, the activist Supreme Court of the 1960s and 1970s, hadn't created the third-party doctrine and applied it in a way that really crippled the ability of the courts to scrutinize surveillance. We would have, all of these issues would be addressed by the Fourth Amendment instead of by Congress. So I think this is a no-brainer for Republicans.
We've talked about the FCC. I'm curious about what happens oversight of the FTC. There's been a little standoff over some of their oversight on protecting against data breaches. This was a big issue for Congressman Terry, obviously, and some standoff over whether or not they should be allowed to proceed forward with the LabMD case, which is another big issue for Darrell Issa. Do tensions in a Republican Congress, do tensions between Capitol Hill and the Federal Trade Commission change or get much worse, or does anything change there?
Well, I hate to monopolize the time here, but this is my pet issue. So I'll just say that you know, nothing's happened in this area for years because Jay Rockefeller was less interested in compromise than anyone I can think of in the Senate. And he was willing to bully and really taunt anybody who dared to suggest that maybe the Federal Trade Commission could use some help from Congress. Maybe it wasn't doing things in necessarily the best way. So you've seen that sort of obstruction in the past. I think you're going to see things change, if only because you have a different ranking member now. So you'll have Democrats who are more willing to sit down and say, well, we haven't reauthorized the FTC in 20 years. Maybe we should. Maybe we should ask, just as the Energy and Commerce Committee has asked about Federal Communications Commission reform. Maybe there are process reforms at the Federal Trade Commission that we should look into. Maybe it's not a good thing that the FTC just regulates entire areas of law like data security for a decade without ever going to court. simply by settling every single case with a consent decree. So I think you're going to see a conversation starting about FTC reform, and that's one that could be very bipartisan, because it's not about attacking the agency. It's about making sure that it's focused on the real harms to consumers, and that it's spending its time well, and that it's really making sure that it's not making consumers unintentionally worse off. So I'm optimistic about that. I think oversights, it's less clear what's going to happen. The Democrats on oversight haven't even bothered to watch the video proffer of an expert witness who was going to testify in a LabMD case about some allegations of corruption between the FTC and the company that it was dealing with. They weren't willing to even talk about that. So I think you're going to see more interest in zeroing in on what the FTC does in the future. And then data security is now a huge issue. I mean, we've had data breaches at major companies. Congress is going to face a lot of pressure to do something. And that something can't just be turn it over to the FTC and let them run wild. It's got to be make sure that the FTC handles that issue and issues like that in a way that does what Congress said the FTC was supposed to do back in 1980, which is to weigh harms and benefits and focus on problems consumers can't avoid. Because let's not forget, the FTC was shut down by a Democratic Congress in 1980 because it ran wild and it tried to regulate everything in America.
So you and I, Berin, we differ on the Wyndham case, so I have a different view of you than you do on that security case. But I think we agree on the issue that the FTC is moving us towards a Europeanization of privacy policy and data policy. And by that I mean they're looking principally at the harms of this. So we saw that, for example, with COPPA reauthorization and children's online privacy. No evidence of harms, none. And yet they're expanding that and extending that. We've seen it with the Facebook case where they're, not the Facebook case, the
Amazon.
No, Amazon case. Yeah. The Amazon case where Amazon was doing one click, essentially one click on in-app purchases. Now they're not, but now we have a law that you're not allowed to do that. And so I think what Congress can and should do with Republican takeover is to go back to this notion of let's look at the trade-offs here. Let's look at the real benefits that we're getting from the data economy, the innovation economy built on all of this, and not just go reflexively down a European path, which is where the Commission has been trying to go, I think.
I would just add that there's two dimensions to this. There's a policy dimension, which is what Rob's getting at. Where is the law going? But there's also a process dimension to this. How is the agency regulating? And essentially, you've got three models. So, and this is relevant for the FCC too. So the first model is traditional regulation. You have a process, you write a regulation, it gets challenged in court, and you know what it is. That's what the FCC traditionally did. There are two other models that look very similar that people get confused. One of them is you do case by case. We've been talking about that for net neutrality, so this is important for how the FCC addresses that issue. They're both case by case, but one of them is that you do case by case, you go to court, you hash it out, the law develops in a meaningful way over time. That's what antitrust law is. And it's changed. Antitrust law got some things wrong. It's realized that some practices actually help consumers, and so the law has evolved over time. That's what I would call an evolutionary model. But then you've got what I would call a discretionary model, which is where the agency doesn't face those sorts of checks, doesn't have to go to court. It's not subject to economic discipline. It just makes it up. And that's what the FTC's been doing. That's what the Federal Communications Commission is starting to do. And I think the big challenge going forward for both agencies, and this is going to be true for a rewrite as well, is making sure that you don't go down the discretionary model and that you have more of an evolutionary model where the courts ultimately make sure the agency is paying attention to whatever substantive standards you put in place.
You've left out a fourth other model, right? One that used to be used at the FCC and is still used in many states, which is the ALJ model, where you have a quasi-judicial process at the agency. Just for purposes of discussion, there's another path.
And they still have it.
My colleague Ray Baum would be very mad at me if I didn't bring this up, being a former PUC chairman.
And they still have it. They still have an ALJ.
I would only say that's part of a proper evolutionary model. The important point is not whether it's the ALJ or the courts. The important point is that it's case by case, which has real meaning. I mean, everything that Kim said before about case by case, about Title VII, that only works if you've got a real standard. The standard can't just be the public interest. Right? But there is another model, we haven't talked about it all day, which is a multi-stakeholder model. So one thing you're going to see in privacy and telecom and other areas of law going forward, and this is where the administration I think has been great, and where Republicans could really work with them, and you may see this become part of any rewrite on telecom law, anything on the FTC, is realizing that internet law challenges are more easily dealt with by multi-stakeholder processes than by government. They're more flexible. The FTC can enforce those, but it's really hard to know how to draw a line in advance in a governmental process.
Do you have something? We're getting to the last 10 minutes or so there's a couple kind of things I want to hit on before we run out of time. One of the things that I'm watching for the next 2 months is what happens with Internet Tax Freedom Act and marketplace fairness, online sales tax, how that gets tied together. There's an effort to tie them together. Is this a fight that is going to end this year, A, and B, where does it go from here? Like, how do these issues get resolved, and is there a threat of a Hungary-like internet tax actually happening in America?
Look, the Internet Tax Freedom Act has to happen because all sorts of terrible things around your phone company having to bill you and all that. So that David's more the expert here. My sense is that that will pass in the lame duck. There'll be something there. I think the real question is, and our view ultimately is those two things should be married together. I think marketplace fairness is a good thing. I think we shouldn't discriminate in favor of one or the other. The real question is how you structure that. And I don't know. I would assume that that whatever happens on tax freedom is done in a way that allows marketplace to come back in and have a joint solution at some point.
Republicans at the end of the day don't want to tax the internet. That's a winning message for voters everywhere. They also want to make sure that you have tax competition. That's why it's important to make sure that there's an origin-based taxation rule, so that if one state doesn't want to have taxes and you base your operations there, that you shouldn't have to pay higher taxes in some other state. And you don't want a system that's too complicated, right? That can be a disaster for small businesses. And if you want to talk about effects on the little guy and on disadvantage in this country, that's the worst thing you could possibly have happen. But I think the big point Republicans can make here is, just to get back to Title II for a moment, Title II means internet taxes. It means subjecting broadband to taxes for Universal Service Fund. So I think you're going to see this conversation merge together with the telecom conversation, and for Democrats to start to think a little more carefully about being careful what they might wish for.
Patent reform is one of the big things that people say has many legs to stand on when heading into next year. I don't want to tread too much into this, but the couple minutes that we have left. The loss of Lee Terry, who's obviously big on the Troll Act and kind of pushing some of these actors, certainly affects that model. I mean, is there a universal sense that patent reform is something that can happen, and copyright reform, which is another thing that's been floating around, especially with regard to music licensing and music rights and royalties? Is this something that we should also be looking forward to?
So I think patent reform has a reasonably good chance of passing because it was held up by Reid in the Senate. It passed the House, and I think what you'll see is the Senate saying, let's come up with their own sort of compromise. Go back to the House, I would imagine, would pass pretty much whatever the Senate passes in this, so I think something will happen there. May not happen right away, but I think the stars are aligned reasonably well on that. I think the copyright issue is earlier in the process. It hasn't gone through as many iterations, and they're still in the process of figuring that out and getting input, and also that may be a little later.
There's been a lot of talk about immigration reform. The president is obviously planning something that has yet to be announced. And there's been some talk about doing something in Congress, potentially on high-skilled immigration and kind of bringing these tech workers in. How much can those two exist together? If the president does something, especially something big, does that poison the well for the chance of any legislative action that might be important to the tech sector?
Yes. I think that's pretty clear. I mean, the greatest frustration on Silicon Valley was the complete failure of groups like Forward.us, which really made an effort to reach out to Republicans. And what they realized is that if you don't do border security, you're not going to have anything happen on immigration. Republicans culturally, to win hearts and minds in tech, they have to do something on immigration, right? Something.
On high skill.
On high skilled, it could be startup visa. They have to be able to pass something.
Yeah, but looking at how woefully non-diverse the tech industry is, you'd think people would be focused on how we can get more of the people who live in America who do have those skills can be married up with Silicon Valley. Because I'm sure what they would say is, oh, we can't find anybody here. We've got to get a visa to bring somebody from this other country. But the reality is we are graduating people who have those, who don't look exactly like those other people. I mean, we could have an America whose industry in tech doesn't even look like America. And it seems to me that's also something that's got to play in this discussion, or it doesn't make sense. Because, I mean, why would we allow those companies to go and get people from other countries on the high, I'm talking about the high level. They're saying, you know, we can't get engineers, we can't, but they're here. They're here in America. They're just maybe not right in Silicon Valley.
I agree with you on part of that. I don't agree with you on another part. The part I don't agree with, I think any of those companies would give their eye teeth to hire a really well-qualified PhD minority computer scientist.
Really?
Yes,
and that's why
absolutely.
They have none. That's why they have done nothing to get those people. I mean, they're here.
You know why? I don't think they're here. Because there just aren't as many, and I think that's part of the problem. We haven't funded these programs. If you look at what the federal government does in supporting STEM education, it is pretty woefully abysmal.
It's true, but there are universities graduating those people with those doctorates in engineering.
And you know what, the unemployment rate for scientists and engineers is at an all-time low, and so people are getting jobs. I think there is a real shortage, and I think, again, it goes back to the same compromise we were talking about with net neutrality and a rewrite of the act. I think the compromise here is the Republicans push for high skill, and Democrats say, you know, fine, okay, but this time we mean it. We're going to put in place a real STEM agenda for this country, including better programs at historically black colleges, including science and math charter high schools in minority communities, like, for example, the Dallas Math and Science Academy. This is one of the greatest high schools in the country. It's something like 90% black and Hispanic. These kids almost all go to college in math and science and engineering. You know how many of these high schools we have? Hardly any.
No, we definitely can agree
that's
on
the
that.
Compromise.
I'm definitely there for the pipeline programs, but what I'm saying is that when you do talk to people in Silicon Valley, what they say is they don't know that those people exist. They don't know where they are, and they do exist. Now maybe they're taking other jobs in other places, but it seems to me that they are graduating engineers at twice the percentage that they're being hired in Silicon Valley. So maybe somebody else is wooing them away with something, but it seems to me that we do have some more that could make it across the country.
But they could also get on a plane and go out to Palo Alto and give their resumes.
Again, I'm whatever we need to do to make that happen, to say that they're not here when there are some people who are here, even though we have this pipeline and eventually, you know, obviously you'll have a pipeline that'll be big enough.
If you look at the rate of minority of Americans, so minority foreigners are different, but because there are more of them, but if, like from India and places, China. But if you look at the rate of minority engineering graduates, for example, it's very small.
Right, but when you compare it to how many are being hired in Silicon Valley, we do graduate twice as many as a percentage of what is being hired. So, you know, if it's 1% that they're picking, there's actually 2%. And I'm not saying that solves the problem, but I'm just saying that people act like there aren't any people. And I think that's a concern. I do think the pipeline has to be bigger and stronger, and there need to be more high schools like the one you just stressed. But you know, it's not just this problem of there are none. It's that, you know, somehow they're not getting together, and maybe we need to spend some more time working on how we find a way to get them together.
Let me just add one thing to this, which is we're talking about the labor market. So there's the labor market externally. There's how you get people into the labor market. There's another dimension of this, which is cities. I mean, one of the big issues I see happening in the next 10 years is urban policy is starting to become a much bigger priority for both parties. And if Republicans are smart, they're going to do what Jack Kemp was trying to do in the 80s and 90s, which is to realize that cities are where creativity happens. Tech sectors, wherever they are, always converge in cities. And so the policy problem here is that cities all around America, the most popular cities to live in, San Francisco is the best example, make it extremely expensive to live there by restricting the supply of housing. So I think that the issue that never gets talked about in these debates is make it easier for people to enter the labor market in high-skilled tech areas by making it easier to live there. You would see more minorities, more Americans of all stripes living in creative cities like that if it were just cheaper to do so. And I think there are actually things that the federal government can do, and you're seeing some Republicans who are starting to to embrace a return to urbanism and realize that the Republican Party can't just be the party of the suburbs because people want to live in cities again.
So I 100% agree with that, and I think that's even more true now. You go to Silicon Valley or San Francisco, and 10 years ago there weren't very many firms south of Market. Yelp is there. A lot of firms are moving up into the city. They want to be there. But Berin, my view of the Republican Party on this issue is they have a sort of if the Democrats are like the Fed should control this, the Republicans are states' rights, and well, whatever the states and cities want to do, and I think they're ignoring the opportunity of using the federal government as a lever with incentives and other kinds of things to get these protectionist rules off the books in cities. So I agree with you. We got to do that, but cities aren't doing that on their own. And I think that's a role for the federal government to say to cities, we're going to give you incentives, good and bad, to change these restrictive zoning rules.
Bet you didn't think we'd be talking about housing policy today.
There you
go. So that's pretty much our hour. I want to let everyone have one more chance to go around. If there's anything, one big thing that everyone should be looking forward to for the next 2 years and 2 months with the Republican Congress, what's changed? How are the next 2 years going to be different than the last 2 years?
Well, I
Kim?
definitely think that it is an opportunity on both sides of the political aisle, because I think Americans, regardless of how you analyze the vote over this past week, the reality is I think Americans want no more gridlock. They want people to get together, to focus, and to do some of the things that real life, everyday Americans need. And I'm hopeful, I will be hopeful and optimistic with you, that people will figure that out, because all these strategists on both sides should be coming together saying, okay, this is what we did wrong, this is what we do right, but during this little period, this is not a time to celebrate on either side, because the reality is in 2 years, the whole ball game can change again. So I'm hoping that people will get together and make the compromises that will make America, certainly in the telecommunications area where it is so important that we not be divided digitally, so important that no matter what color you are or where you come from, you're not divided.
What'll be different for us has nothing to do with the change in the ratios in either chamber. It has to do with the fact that we are reaching the end of the period that my boss has said would be our listening and learning period, and starting to really engage with stakeholders. So starting in January, I would expect there to be much more very public bipartisan outreach from the committee on ComAct update and trying to put pen to paper and move some policies out there for folks to be debating.
I think the big difference is a lot of the bills that David helped with and his boss led will now get out of the Senate, or get in the Senate and then get out of the Senate.
Look, Republicans won in states like Maryland by 9 points by talking about outreach, compromise, post-partisanship, all the themes that Obama ran on in 2007. If the Republicans are listening, they'll realize that that's how they win in 2016. That's how they become a majority party for the next generation. And the question is whether the leadership in both chambers is strong enough to transmit that message through. And you're going to be able to tell pretty quickly if you see Republicans talking about things like Congressional Review Act and just having votes that don't do anything, that are for symbolism, you'll know that the Republicans really haven't learned their lesson. If you see the Republicans getting wins on the board on things like ECPA reform and on harder things like net neutrality, you'll know that they have learned their lesson and that they're doing what I think they should be doing, which is using tech as a way of rebuilding their brand. So I think we'll see in the first 6 months of the next Congress.
I guess that should do it. Thank you all so much for joining us, and thank you for the inaugural episode of Tech Freedom TV. It's been fun.
Thanks.